Welcome back to the FIDE World Rapid 2025. It's Magnus versus Arjun on board 1. Both players are currently tied for first place. And Magnus, of course, he's late by 30 seconds as usual. And before even playing his first move, he is adjusting his pieces. Let's see what he decides to play. He starts by playing knight to f3, keeping things flexible. Maybe he'll play some sort of d4, some sort of c4. And Arjun also keeps it flexible by playing knight f6. Yes, c4 is played. And still this can turn into anything. Asymmetrical. Nope. Maybe not. e6. Knight c3. d5 and d4. Okay, so we have some sort of queen's gambit declined. Knight to d7. Bishop g5. And there's still plenty of ways that this game can go. Bishop b4. I believe this is what's known as the Regon. Yeah, Magnus plays e3. Makes sense. Activating the bishop on f1. And now c5 is played. And I think Arjun's intention is quite clear. He's trying to blast. Open the center of the board, get a bunch of piece trades, and head towards a draw perhaps. Yeah, Magnus takes on c5. And Arjun, he decides to bring out his queen to a5, adding more pressure onto the knight on c3. So Magnus kind of kills the pressure on the diagonal by moving his knight back to d2. And Arjun can take on c3. That would be a pawn. The pawn on c5 is pretty weak. And here I think black is quite happy. He's going to castle king side. He's nice and safe. There's a few weaknesses on the queen side on c5 and maybe a2, but black has weaknesses of his own. The pawn on d5 is isolated. The bishop on c8 has a hard time moving because maybe the pawn on b7 is weak, restricted by the pawn on c5. Magnus starts with bishop to b5 check. Nice tempo move clearing the way for the king to castle. Bishop comes up to d7. And so if Magnus takes on d7, the knight will drop back adding pressure on c5. Okay, he throws in rook to c1. Nice in turn. The queen is forced to retreat back to a5. And after a trade on d7, Magnus can choose to defend maybe with queen c2, but he opts to castle, keeping things solid. Yen Arjun, he takes the opportunity to take on c5 with the knight. Knight b3 offering more piece trades. Okay. Magnus takes the queen, hitting b7, hitting d5. Yeah. And of course, Arjun decides to castle. He's also trying to keep things solid, letting Magnus take on b7, which he does, but this allows black to take on a2. So temporarily, it looks like black has this outside a pawn, but Magnus quickly plays rook a1, which hits the queen, and now the a7 pawn is taken. And we have a position that should be a draw. Rook to c8 activating. Yeah, even though black has this isolated pawn on d5, it's really hard to make progress with just these major pieces. Sorry. But Magnus can play this position forever. He can slowly load some pressure against the d5 pawn and maybe at some moment he'll take on d5. Even that position is a draw, but Magnus can also play the resulting position. Let's see. Okay, queen to a4. Trying to blockade the d5 pawn. If Arjun can ever push that pawn and trade off his weakness, that would be exactly what he wants. But Magnus is not going to make that easy. Rook to a1. Maybe freeing up the queen which was previously tied down to the rook, and so Arjun he decides to keep being annoying. The queen is still tied down to the rook. Queen to b2. Rook goes to f1. Now the queen doesn't have any more babysitting duties. And also the rook on f1 is protecting the pawn on f2, which could be maybe a bit vulnerable if the rook were to come down to the second rank. Magnus deciding what to do. He attacks the pawn on d5. And the players here are already pretty low on time. Magnus has used up almost all his time. He just has 2 minutes left. In this type of position, he really doesn't need that much time on the clock, so it's probably okay for him. Arjun still close to 7 minutes. Yeah. Queen d2. Okay. Eyeing the pawn again. Queen c4. Solid. How will Magnus win this pawn? That's the real question. Okay. He starts by attacking d5 and Arjun maybe he can go. Rook to d8. But he goes pawn to h5. He's giving up the pawn. Of course. If Magnus were to trade queens, then that position would be a draw. But I think he decides not to take the pawn right away because maybe the rook could have given a check on the back rank to Arjun. He says, take my pawn. Rook to a8. And Magnus first, he decides to throw in a check and I think he's going to put his queen on b7, which will hit the rook and the pawn. Now the rook can go to d8. There's still. But maybe there's like some queen e7 attacking the rook again. And Arjun, yeah, he brings down his rook to a2. He's giving up the pawn, but he knows that the resulting position, if you trade off queens, is a draw. And so Magnus, he goes for it. And we have this position where Magnus is up one pawn. All the pawns are on the same side of the board. And these positions, they're quite easy to draw, but Magnus is also the best endgame player in the world, maybe in history. And so, he's going to try to squeeze some life into the position. Let's see. Arjun, he's just going to keep waiting and he's going to put his rook in places that limit white's progress. What white wants to do is to try to throw up some pawns like so. And he wants to try to break up black's pawn structure. If he can somehow separate the pawns, then those pawns could become weaknesses. And so Arjun's just waiting. And sometimes Magnus will also wait, kind of just buying some time. Also just maybe adding some pressure. Each time there's a move, Arjun has to think for a few seconds. And so at some point I imagine Magnus is going to play the move pawn to f3 because right now the rook on the second rank is eyeing this weak pawn. And so you kind of have to make progress somehow. Yeah. First Magnus starts by locking up the king side and also cutting off the black king on the back rank. Arjun still waiting. Yeah. f3 should be coming soon. f3. There it is. And now the king can slowly march up into the position via f4. Maybe g5. We'll see. Okay, rook to g2. Yeah, maybe g4 is a threat here trying to take on h5 and split the pawns. And so that's why Arjun, he plays rook to f2. Now if g4 is played, then after h takes g4, f takes g4 is not possible. The king has to take and that should be okay for black. Pawn to e5. Arjun he still has to wait. He doesn't have to do anything crazy. Doesn't have to rush to trade off the pawns. Rook to f1. Yeah, that's good. Still stopping pawn to g4 and also restricting the king. The king is tied down to this. f3 pawn. So Magnus just waits. He's going to figure out what to do. But each time he plays a waiting move, Arjun has to burn a few seconds off the clock. And when time starts to get a bit low and the nerves are at its limit, then Magnus will start to push. He gives a check. He drops back to b3. Maybe this allows the king to move. Okay. Rook to e2. Arjun's threat starting to take the pawn. So that's why Magnus gives a check, kicking the king back. And I think at some point Magnus he's going to put the rook on f6, which will target the f7 pawn, but also defend the f3 pawn. Okay, he gives a check. Okay, he has to be careful not to allow repetition. And there it is. Rook to f6. Now the king is probably able to go to g5. And maybe you're still playing for g4. Or maybe the king is trying to run into h6 and g7, which eyes the f7 pawn. Okay, Arjun, he plays rook to h2. That does stop g4. Because the pawn on h4 would hang. So Magnus plays king to g5, threatening to come into the dark squares, but also I think g4 now is possible. So maybe Arjun will play and g4 is still possible there, but it doesn't really do much because you can't really take on h5 because there's a pin. So Magnus starts to invade onto the dark squares. King h6. Arjun takes the pawn, but the king, white king is coming in, so things might get a bit scary. Magnus starts with f4. Keeping everything glued together. And yes, Arjun, he can go for the h4 pawn, but he finds the correct defensive maneuver. King f8, king e7. And after pawn takes on f7, if the king were to take the rook, then white would make a new queen. So, he goes back to f8. Amazing defensive maneuver by Arjun. But here, Magnus, he's up a pawn, right? Of course, he can't offer a rook trade. Arjun that is. So, he plays rook to h3. And now Magnus has an annoying choice of which pawn he wants to defend. Probably the h-pawn. He'd rather have these two. These two pawns instead of there you go. King g5. He's going to win the h-pawn at some point. And seemingly out of nowhere, Magnus I believe the material bounce was even before like out of the opening and. Now suddenly he's up 2 pawns. Now the position it's still a draw. This f and h pawn they don't coordinate so well together. If the pawns were connected that would be a completely different story. But here what Arjun has to do is he's going to defend from behind with his rook. Like on f1, g1, h1. And then eventually when the h-pawn comes close enough to his side of the board, he's going to switch to lateral defense, but it's still up 2 pawns. Up 2 pawns and a dream and low on time. These positions can be a bit hard to play. And so Magnus again, he's milking the clock. It's so amazing how patient this guy is. He's going to keep waiting, poking, prodding, maybe slowly improving the position while also figuring out the best way to squeeze. And then once the time is right, then he'll start pushing the pawns. Yeah, this check is always uncomfortable. If the king goes to h8 or h7, it feels like you're cutting off your own king, right? Because the rook can stay on the g-file. But maybe that's not the best way to make progress. Rook to e6. The black king is cut off, but it's a hard job that the white king has to do to escort these pawns because this black rook is such a pesky piece. Okay, rook to h1. The pawn on h4 needs to be guarded. Magnus throws in a check. And looks like okay he goes king or sorry rook to e8. If the king were to go to h5 that would be checkmate in 1. Rook to h8. And so that's why Arjun he decides to wait on g7 h7. And I think this is Arjun's plan. He's going to wait on g7 and h7. And he's just going to shuffle the rook back and forth on the first rank behind the pawns. And that should be enough for a draw. But should is always very uncertain with Magnus, right? He just has this uncanny ability to squeeze anything out of a drawn position. And so Magnus starts with a check in Arjun. He does have the option of going king to h5, but maybe you can get into trouble there. Okay, white walks over to g5, guarding both pawns. Yeah, Arjun throws in a check and most likely Magnus is going to snake his way back like via g4 h3 and put the king on g3. Guarding both pawns and then maybe if the rook is a check then you can kind of attack the rook with your king. Okay, Magnus keeps the black king cut off. He's realizing that these checks weren't doing any good for him. And Arjun is now down to under a minute. There is a 10-second increment. So, he does have plenty of time to work with. And this is not the hardest endgame. To try to defend with low time, but you still have to be precise. Okay. Rook to f2. Attacking the pawn. See, I feel like so many people here would already be pushing these pawns. f5. Let's go. But Magnus, he's patient. He slowly brings the king back. King to g4. And the rook goes to g2. Then he'll probably run to f3 or h3. And then put the king on g3. There'll be no more checks there. King f3. Rook goes over to h2, hitting the h-pawn. And yeah, now king g3. Now, instead of waiting on fg and h, the rook comes over to b2. Magnus cuts off the king on the 7th rank, and soon he's going to have to start pushing these pawns. Yeah, Arjun stops him, but king g4 doesn't enable the push. Okay, rook to a3. Just waiting, not allowing any checks. Maybe the rook will go behind the pawns. We'll see. The king marches up to g4. Okay. King f6. Most likely Magnus will throw in a check to kick the king back one rank. Yeah, there we go. And now one of these pawn pushes. They're coming soon. But which one to push exactly? I would probably push h5. If you start pushing the f-pawn, maybe you're cutting off the rook site. 1727 so moving up the h-pawns. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Okay, rook to g1. King f5. Rook g6 is a big threat. So, Arjun probably has to move off the g-file. Or maybe he can move the king. Okay, rook to b2. Yeah, rook g6. Again, this annoying check, it always feels like you're getting cut off. If you go to h7, then you're cut off on the h-file. If you go to f7, then this h-pawn, it looks a little scary. But you should always be able to defend as black. 1813 What will Magnus do? He starts by moving the king over to g5. Interesting. Rook check. And now will he go to h6? That's interesting. The king goes in front of the pawn. So he's trying to escort this way. Is a bit superficial though. Okay. Now the f-pawn is under attack. And how will Magnus make progress in this position? It's tough. Okay. Rook g5. Yeah, it does feel a little scary for black. Like this black king, it's a bit cut off from the scary h-pawn, but at the same time, he's kind of cutting off white's king from re-entering the game. Okay, king h7. Yeah, Magnus running down to 2 seconds before playing that move. But it looks like the panic did not really help him. King to g8. I think one of these pawns is just falling. Arjun can take on f4 probably. Just has to make sure. Yep. Take on f4. And looks like the game is heading towards a draw unfortunately for Magnus. Yeah, he was able to squeeze something out of the position, right? It was a drawn endgame and then suddenly. He was up 1 pawn and then suddenly up 2 pawns and then finally. After some stubborn defense by Arjun and relentless attacking by Magnus, it looks like the game is about to peter out into a draw. The king is still cut off because of this rook on the g-file, but I think this position should be a theoretical draw. What black is going to do is put the rook usually behind the white pawn. And then once the h-pawn moves a little bit up the board, then the side checks come. Yeah, like here. Yeah, just some lateral defense. Rook b8, rook b7. And yeah, the players they agree to a draw. Tough game, but amazing defensive skills by Arjun and Magnus. We saw shades. Shades of his black magic. He was able to create something and the players are discussing some variations. Okay, if you want to see more content from the FIDE World Rapid